Outstanding. Welcome, everyone. As people are joining to the conversation we are going to have with Gustavo Razzetti, I'm really excited with talking with Gustavo about culture, also hybrid work, which I know a lot of my clients and organizations I interact with have a big challenge with. Before I introduce Gustavo a little bit more, want to mention next month we have Eduardo Briceno on the performance paradox. Eduardo also has an outstanding book. He is a growth mindset expert and how organizations can implement growth mindset and live it in the organization. So I'm also looking forward to that. And as an aside, both on Gustavo and me, for any of you who attended the dinner a couple of nights ago, I still haven't fully recovered my voice from the dinner. So if you haven't attended it, you want to say hi in chat, do that. Want to send emails, would love to hear from you both on that. And if you have questions, those of you attending for Gustavo, please make sure to put it in the Q&A feature. I will make sure to follow Q&A in order to incorporate those questions to Gustavo, who just shared. Gustavo has been in Europe and then in Canada. So his jet lag is there, but Gustavo has a lot of energy and excitement because he works with clients and organizations on organizational culture. Gustavo is author of 4 outstanding books, including his latest, which is Remote, Not Distant. So he talks about how we can operate in the future of work, which is going to continue to be more hybrid. As much as some CEOs, Gustavo, don't want to hear that, the hybrid is here to stay and it will be more hybrid as more technology tools, including AI, take off. So he's an expert on that, has spent a lot of time thinking, writing, and working with clients. Gustavo, we are thrilled to have you in the conversation with Leadership Greater Washington.
Thank you, Mahan. Very excited to be here and see where our conversation takes us.
Outstanding. Jasmine, by the way, you can take off the thank you for that. Gustavo, first, I know you have been a culture expert. Even before reading your book, I had come across the culture canvas that you had developed. So we talk a lot about organizational culture. Now, I have 2 questions packaged in one to give you a chance to share some of your thoughts. One, how do you see organizational culture? And 2, all of us in Leadership Greater Washington, all the executives I interact with and all the leaders, we believe we have great organizational cultures. So who are these people whose organizational cultures need improvement? And why does the data show so many employees feel their culture in their organization is not that great when the executives think, no, we've got it all set?
Wow, that was a huge packed question, a couple of questions for someone who just came from a lot of travel. So thank you, Mahan. Now, let's begin by what do we mean by culture? I think that a culture, usually everyone agrees that culture matters, but every time I ask CEOs from different types of companies, from Fortune 500 to high growth startups, nonprofits, what's culture to you? No one can really put that in words. Of course, people use the typical culture, it's a strategy for breakfast, or culture is the way we do things here. But in the end, those are just definitions that don't necessarily capture the essence of culture. So you mentioned the culture design culture canvas, and we talk about the ABC of culture. So the canvas has 10 building blocks, but there are 3 key sections. One is alignment. So culture is about what's the future we're trying to build together, and how are we aligning to that vision, the purpose, the values, the priorities, and the behaviors we reward and those we punish. The second part, B, is for belonging. So the glue that brings people together. So do we feel safe? So psychological safety, do we feel safe to have courageous conversations, to take risks, to experiment? Feedback, not the formal side of feedback, but how do we help each other learn and grow? And the team rituals, those ways that we celebrate culture, we celebrate progress, and we remind ourselves of the behaviors that we want to continue to promote. And lastly, collaboration, which is about decision-making, meetings, what I call more the functional side of culture, norms and rules that basically, so culture is a system. So it's alignment, it's belonging, it's collaboration. In the second part, there's no such a thing as a perfect culture. And this is something that my clients always ask me when we start doing some kind of assessment, do I have a great culture? Is my culture perfect? And there's no such a thing, right? A culture is something dynamic and it's always evolving. You never stop taking care of culture, right? You always need to work on it. You make progress on one area and then you need to fix something else. So it's a never-ending story. To summarize, the biggest thing that we need to understand, we say who needs to fix their culture. I don't want to talk about fixing because it feels that something is broken. I like to think about evolving. Culture is something that's always evolving. It evolves organically, but also requires intentional effort to make sure it's evolving organically, but in the direction you want.
I love the way you put it, Gustavo. It's a living system. It's not static, and it's definitely not something that is captured in a document that sometimes I've seen people try to do. So let me briefly touch on a couple of the elements that you mentioned. You mentioned alignment first, and that's one of the big challenges that I see in teams and organizations. So how do you guide organizations on getting greater alignment in their culture?
Yeah, the point about alignment is an illusion, right? Because many times we think we are aligned and actually most teams are not. If you get in front of any boardroom and you ask the C-suite of any company, are you guys aligned in terms of priorities, what you want to achieve together, goals? People are going to tell you what? Yes,
Absolutely.
we are. But then, so the nice way to probe this is to start asking, like, for example, each of you guys write, what are the top 3 priorities for our company? What are the key 3 goals? How are we going to measure success? What are the key challenges that we have? And let them share. And I can tell you that every time we do that exercise, you're going to see there are huge gaps. Okay. So first of all, because I think that we rush alignment. So many alignment requires first, like the commit and the disagree and commit approach. We need to address disagreements. And often CEOs force alignment, they rush it because they think that where they are is where other people are. And that's not necessarily good, because if you rush alignment, then when people go back to running their divisions, their operational departments, they're going to forget about that alignment. So without those misalignment conversations, we're not going to get anywhere. The second part of alignment is we're trying to align teams in too many things, and it's hard to do that. And so the most important thing is, what are we trying to achieve together and why, rather than aligning people too much into the how we're going to get there.
And Gustavo, what you just mentioned is a brilliant point, and I would encourage every single person watching, listening to do. It's something that I did earlier this week with a CEO and a board, and I've done with a lot of executives, and it is incredible how misaligned the actual reality is, the actuality is, as opposed to people's perceptions, which is just, I had the board members write the top 3 priorities in their perspective for the CEO, because there have been a lot of issues, and the CEO write the top 3 priorities. And I don't think you would be shocked. They were shocked at how misaligned the board was, along with what their expectations were for the CEO. And I do that with senior teams as well, and did one last week. So I would encourage everyone, as you're thinking, yes, we are aligned, my team is aligned, my people are aligned. Simple 3x5 card, have them write down their top 3 priorities with clarity, not generalities, not make sure customers are happy, and write down what you believe their top 3 priorities should be. And that's one way to have conversations around that alignment. So I love what you just mentioned, Gustavo.
Yeah, thank you. There's another exercise that we do, that one thing are the business priorities, because our work focuses more on culture. We want to address what are the cultural priorities, or in other words, what's the criteria that leaders use when it comes to making key decisions? And we use these even over statements, right? So even over means that we have two things that we really value that are really, really important, but when push comes to shove, we need to choose one over the other, right? So for example, Amazon says speed even over perfection. Both matter, but when they have to choose, speed comes first. So I see a lot of clients that say that they are people first, innovation first, profit first, and so on and so forth. And you cannot have too many first as a company. So when we start asking them what comes first, people even over profit or profit even over profit, to your point, you start having lots of conversations that the team is not really aligned in terms of what they want to prioritize.
Gustavo, so when there is that alignment, you also mentioned belonging, and I know you emphasize that sense of belonging.
I lost Mahan. I don't know, it's me.
Gustavo, it could be on my end. On the belonging side, what do the teams and organizations that have better belonging do differently?
Yeah, I think that the first part, I know that we talk a lot about this during the pandemic, and companies now are forgetting about doing, which is the more we get to know each other personally, the better we're going to work together. So trust, it's based not only on functional trust or head trust, which is I trust you as a professional, that you know how to do your job, that you have the right skills and expertise to succeed within your functional role, but also that I trust you as a human being. So basically, when I'm not in the room, that you're going to have my best interests at heart, that you're going to have my back, and also that I can trust you as a human being. And if we don't work on that human side, then there's always going to be like, yeah, I trust you professionally, but do you have my best interest at heart? So create that sense of human belonging, that sense of a human connection is critical.
And how do you do that effectively, Gustavo, at a time when now a lot of organizations are operating in a hybrid uh, environment where 3, 4 days a week is in the office, 1 day a week is out of the office? What are practices that you find enable that sense of belonging, including there are teams and organizations that have members who are not physically present in the region, for example, to go in the office at all?
Yeah, I think that basically to provide some perspective, there are many teams that have been operating in hybrid settings or complete remote for many decades because they were global teams and they couldn't interact together. And yet they were able to function not only really well, but actually create that sense of connection. So I think the key is being intentional about it. There are people that still think that culture is only organic and let bring people together and culture is going to happen. Yes, but not necessarily the right culture. So how can we be intentional? One thing that we use, you mentioned practices, is doing the what we call the washing instructions. So we have a canvas that each team member can complete to share with their team members how they want to be treated, how they want to collaborate. Are they a person who prefer to talk to think or think to talk? Are they more introvert or not? Do you prefer to work in the morning or late hours? Do they prefer to share ideas on larger groups or not? So we call them washing instructions because the same way that your clothes come with a label that says how they want to be treated, people need to be clear. So you can have those canvases in a place, like in a mural board, where people can check how each team member wants to be treated, how they want to collaborate, how they like to communicate. Do they prefer email over phone calls or whatever that is? And then the magic happens building what are the team washing instructions? How can we build common ground? Because if we only default to people's individual preferences, then we don't have a team. So we need to find a balance between what I want as a person, what you want as a person, what George wants as a person or Doug. But then we also need to come with some agreements, how we're going to collaborate and work together.
So, Gustavo, as we do that, again, one of the things that you mentioned is the paradox of hybrid. Would love for you to talk about that paradox because I was meeting with a CEO on at end of the day on Monday, and he was mentioning how, by all measures, the productivity in their team is way below what it was before the pandemic. Initially, there had been increase in productivity at the beginning of going remote, and as there has been a level of return to office, productivity is really low. His dream and hope was to go fully back to 5 days in the office, but at this point, because of talent, can't pull that off. And you talk about this paradox of hybrid requiring flexibility and discipline. Would love for you to give advice to that CEO and others who are worried about productivity.
Absolutely. I think that for me, the word productivity scares me a little bit, especially on a white collar kind of arrangement, because in the end, it's not how much, it's not about the outcome. It's not about the input, it's about the impact, right? Many people are measuring productivity, focusing on how many hours are people working, how much input they are creating, how many meetings they attend, how many reports they write, how many presentations they share, whatever that is. But in the end, does that move the needle or not, right? Today I was seeing a post on LinkedIn that was talking exactly about this, and it was a nice, from Roberto Ferraro, a nice drawing that basically showed on one end, coal, like you struck from a mine, and then on the other hand, the diamond, right? So many people are still measuring how much coal are we extracting, but if you're looking for diamonds, that's not a productivity thing, it's about digging in the right place. And I think that impact is not just about how much work people produce, it's about how much they move the needles. So going back to alignment, what are the key goals? What are the key metrics in which measure success rather than measuring either input or output?
And that is a big challenge for a lot of teams and organizations. So again, how do you guide them to measure out, be more outcome oriented rather than activity oriented? It's again, I've worked with clients in trying to do that, and it's a big struggle for them.
It is a bit struggle. I always think in terms of the vanity metrics. Now, for example, we use social media because something that people are very familiar with. Companies are still measuring like in things like engagement, shares, like a lot of metrics that really don't tell exactly about who cares if your content is being shared thousands of times. So the point is, does that change the perception about your brand, about your service, about your product? Does that really create an appetite for people to engage with you at a deeper level, buy your product, recommend your product? So I think that we're still measuring things that are very superficial, but many companies are still struggling to identify what are the metrics that really address what drives the business forward, right? So that, once again, it's a conversation, and with all the technology and with artificial intelligence, we're going to get closer to understanding what really moves the needle and what really are vanity metrics that we need to stop measuring. No? So companies are measuring too many things, and that's the problem of our technology. Now everything can be measured, and that everything can be measured doesn't mean that everything should be measured. No, we need to focus on what are the top 2-3 things that are really drive the business forward.
So, Gustavo, with that though, I wonder, therefore, can jobs fully be done remote? You, I know, consult with and work with you and your organization, companies around the world. And you work in Europe, in Canada, do a lot of work here in the States, all around the world. Uh, what is the right answer with respect to, if you're outcome oriented, could people just be working remote? Or is there value to being in person? And how do organizations look at roles and teams with that future of work in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are two things that we need to consider. First is what the organization wants, and then what people want. Going back to the watching instructions, there are people that even if their role can be done fully remote, they want to, because of their personalities or because of their household. I mean, some people don't have capabilities to work from home, or they have some family things going on that they want to spend that much time at home. So they maybe want to be more in person. So I think it's a conversation about how can we balance. In the end, for me, it's not about how we work. It's not about the setting. It's not about how many days in the office or remote. It's about how can we do our best work together. So people are still thinking in remote and in person like two opposite things rather than things that complement each other. So the question is, it's not about bringing people back to the office, it's what for. So if you're going to bring someone to an open space that's loud, that's full of interruptions, so people can write emails or Slack messages and do presentations that they can be doing from home, that doesn't add any value. Actually, it's going to frustrate people because they already know that they can do that type of work from home, saving time in a calmer environment. They can manage their time, and also they avoid the costs, the commute, and many other things. So when we get together, we need to get together to either discuss very critical things that are more strategic, issues that the team is going through that are harder to solve remotely or asynchronous, or to build that belonging. So there are companies that work fully remote, but still they're bringing people together maybe 4 times a year. And when they get together, they spend a full week, and they're not talking about operational things. They're focusing on how can we build better communication. They're talking about strategic issues. They're talking about priorities. They're talking about what's working, what's not working. So when they're together, they're very intentional, and they're tackling complex issues, not operational day-to-day minutia.
That is hard though, Gustavo. So I agree with the thought, but as I see some organizations like struggling with that, they've had an easy time coming up with a number of days in the office. So one
Yeah.
of the things many started at the beginning was giving people saying you can be in the office 3 days a week or 4 days, you can choose the days. And that ended up being crazy. And for any teams that are doing that, it's crazy because you have people in the office who then go on their Zoom calls because there are people who are not in the office. And that, in my view, that has been crazy. But then on the other side, when they are asking people to come in 3 days or 4 days a week, work is more like the way work was in 2019. There is nothing that is different with respect to what you're mentioning in taking advantage of people being in the office. How can managers, leaders of teams think about that? And how can they do that? I understand the concept, but how do you approach it? How do you do it?
There are two key things. And first of all, it's not easy. And the point is, many times we avoid doing the right thing because it's not easy and we take shortcuts. And then once again, we went through a huge experiment because of the pandemic. And instead of leveraging those learnings, we're going to forget and go back to your point. Who wants to go back how things used to be instead of evolving? And you mentioned artificial intelligence. Now we have even more tools that can help us become even more productive. So the first thing is, one of the biggest mistakes is that companies are making a one-size-fits-all approaches. So they're defining how the company works instead of thinking how different teams should work, because every team has a different cadence, rhythm, different types of interactions, and different responsibilities that require different arrangements. The
So,
second
Gustavo,
is,
let me
yeah,
jump in and interrupt you just for a second.
yeah.
So I wholeheartedly agree with you. The focus needs to be more on the teams. And I was working with a client that actually did that, but then people from different teams were starting to become more negative, unhappy. Why do people in that team get to be in the office only 2 days a week when we have to be in the office 4 days a week? So if it has to be granular at the team level, that by itself causes some issues, doesn't it?
It does, but once again, people can choose to first adapt, or they can choose to work in a different department or different team. So I think that that's where companies, instead of being realistic with people or being honest more than realistic, they try to basically make everyone happy, and that doesn't work, right? First of all, there are jobs that require fully presence, right? If you're in customer service and if you work in a branch at a bank, for example, well, maybe you need to be there fully time. That's one thing, and you need to, that's the reality of your job. The same way that people that work in factories start at 6 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. So those differences have been there always. The second part is challenging the assumptions. So many companies have started asking people in blue collars job, can you work in a flexible way? Can you work one day from home? And people are starting to find solutions. So I think that that's the other thing. It's not predefining based on how things used to be, but basically approaching a more open-minded. The second part of a team level is that we need to let the work define the working schedule and not the work schedule define how we work. Okay. So what I mean by this is many teams work in sprints. So when you're on the moment that you're strategizing or maybe building a new functionality or developing how the new app is going to work, maybe you need people to be not only 1 week, fully week, maybe 2 weeks together, one after the other. And then maybe for a month, they don't need to see each other in person. So the point of these 4 days, 3 days is that it doesn't make any sense. We're forcing people, we're recreating another a 9 to 5 schedule that applies to everyone rather than thinking, how can our team do the rest work? So the question is, hey guys, what does our project pipeline look in the next month or 2 months? And how do we need to tackle each of those key phases? And that requires that we meet or don't meet, or maybe we meet a lot and then we don't see each other for a month. Instead of, let's see you 3 months, we're brainstorming, we're getting somewhere, and then boom, we split again and we don't get together and we're going to lose that momentum.
Yeah, I love the way you put it, Gustavo, and that requires a lot of flexibility. Even if we look at the fact that uh, very few jobs are really 9 to 5 anymore, with access to email and information and needing to do projects. A lot of times people are working all kinds of hours. So the old 9 to 5, 5 days a week, that structure, that formula doesn't fit. Therefore, it requires flexibility with respect to teams and more of a project oriented approach. But you also say that has to be balanced with discipline. What's the discipline that needs to balance that flexibility?
Yeah, I'm gonna, if you don't mind, table that for a second. I'm gonna do exactly. I have a follow-up question for you. How many clients have you worked with that tell you that they want to be agile?
Oh, almost everyone wants to be agile, especially now
Okay,
they all want to have agile strategies.
for sure. But what's the synonym of agile is flexibility, right? You cannot become agile with a rigid one size fits all mindset. And I think that's the key thing that companies are struggling with. They are not being agile in mindset. They want to adopt a methodology. Agile, they want to adopt flexible workplace or a hybrid, but they're still not changing that mindset. And if that doesn't change, then no matter what model they use, 4 days a week, 8 days a week at the office, whatever that is, it's not going to work. And that's the thing. We're not discussing the root cause of all these issues. For example, there are many CEOs that now making public certain conversations that were a few months ago happening behind the scenes. That is, yeah, forcing people back to the office has nothing to do with culture, has nothing to do with productivity, has everything to do with profit. They know that by pushing people back to the office, many people are going to quit, and that's going to save them a lot of money. And that's one of the key root causes behind this conversation that we hear in the media.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read an article earlier today in Fast Company that was just about that. That in a couple of instances, some of these larger employers are pushing people back into the office as an easier way for layoffs. So that's a interesting perspective. But as you mentioned, that agile, we want that agility. But uh, uh, Gustavo, I know you work with a lot of HR departments as well. That runs counter to a lot of HR approaches where they say, no, we need to come up with rules and systems and approaches for everyone to follow.
Yeah, but once again, we need to decentralize HR, right? We cannot have a HR department at the top that's basically informing every culture. No, so one of the things that we talk a lot with clients and more clients, I was having when I was in Canada, conversation with a client about exactly that. People are understanding that the culture is not something homogeneous, right? The culture of the company, it's actually the result or the sum of all the subcultures. So rather than have a top-down approach that this is the culture defined by HR, CEOs, and anyone has to adopt it, it's more like it works both ways. So yeah, there are certain definitions. For example, when it comes to alignment, that comes from the top. But then how we build belonging, how we build collaboration, that should be defined and informed by the people that are doing the work. And actually, there are certain pockets in the organization, certain groups, areas, subcultures that may have practices that are not only great for them to do it their own way, but actually can inspire other areas to work differently and better. So I think that the issue is many companies are trying to find what's the solution here at the top, rather than going to the teams and say, hey, which of our teams has been doing great works and who has found that right model that we might maybe replicate in other areas or scalate from bottom up, or
So
from
in that,
inner up, right? Not just from the bottom, but from the center up.
yeah, so in that both bottom up, center out, you also talk in your book, Gustavo, and you mention a lot about the need for resetting cultures, as you mentioned at the very beginning of our session and conversation today, is the fact that culture is constantly evolving. So for the leaders at LGW, whether they're running an organization in many instances or a team, how can they think about resetting their culture? So let's say they buy it, that it's constantly evolving. I need to work on it. It's not good enough, which is good for them. That's why they have joined or they are listening to this conversation. The people who think it's good enough are the ones who don't know that they don't know, so they aren't seeking answers. So how can they do that?
Yeah, one exercise I share in the book, and I share actually the template as well, it's basically many people, many leaders are reacting to the scenario. So of course, the pandemic was an event that no one could have predicted. It happened and everyone had to adapt. And there were companies that, because they were really adapted or agile, they were able to actually adapt pretty quickly. And many companies struggled a lot. I mean, everyone struggled, but some companies actually struggled a lot. And some companies were able to figure out, because first they were purpose driven. So people were basically aligned by something bigger than simply metrics or goals. Second, they trusted their people. So the companies that trusted their teams before the pandemic, they trusted that people could figure out how to work. They trusted that even if they were invisible, they would be committed to doing great work. While the ones that didn't trust the people basically promote a culture of people working more hours, pretending that they were working, not creating that impression that, hey, I'm here, but actually the visibility, but wasn't necessarily driving work. So resetting the culture involves three things. We need to understand what was our culture, how was our alignment, belonging, collaboration before the pandemic, right? In, let's say, what used to be normal times. Second, what happened, good or bad? How did we adapt during the pandemic? And especially, what are the new practices and things that we learned that we could do differently? And then in this new context, we need to leverage both the good and bad from each of those phases. I think that people are skipping first the reflection, but most importantly, they're forgetting about the lessons, and they're forgetting that they're thinking that the pandemic was a hiatus. And then, okay, let's forget about it. Let's get back to normal, rather than redesigning what that new normal should look like, leveraging both instances.
And how much time do the clients you work with, obviously they are concerned about or they care about culture, that's why they engage with you, but when you've done your research, you've looked at this, how much time and effort should it occupy in the mind of organizational leaders, Gustavo, in that there are times when, once a year I find people getting together and they reflect on culture. There are some that do it on a more regular bases, paying focus and attention on it. What is your recommendation to organizations?
Yeah, I would say that it all depends on the company size, complexity, but at least once a year. My recommendation is on a quarterly basis. So we heard, I mean, the idea culture and strategy complement each other, right? And basically, if you spend, like most executive teams meet at least on a quarterly basis to discuss strategy. So what's working, what's not, what's our business heading, that should include a culture discussion. So with most of my clients, that's what happens. So they get together, like I work a lot with the global executive teams. So the senior leadership team get together and on a quarterly basis to talk about strategy, and at least they spend one day and I'm there helping them, facilitating that conversation about culture.
So once a quarter to once a year, dedicated focus to it. By the way, I want to mention, and we'll mention it again toward the end, that both the culture canvas and there's a lot of other great templates and tools right on your website that people can use to have these conversations. So it should be a priority. And when there is a priority, both with your book and the canvas and other resources, the tools for the conversations are there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, so Gustavo, one of the areas we haven't touched on yet is the value of rituals. What role do rituals play in organizational culture, and how can we proactively think about some of the rituals for our teams and organizations?
Absolutely. So rituals are like an emotional way to celebrate culture, but celebrating culture doesn't necessarily practicing appreciative rituals, right? And that's what most companies do. There's nothing wrong about that, but rituals are more powerful than simply, for example, Airbnb has this way of welcoming new employees that they create a human tunnel, like everyone holding their hands, and then the new hires come from one end to another, like they enter the tunnel like an outsider, and they basically exited as one of us, as our Airbnb. That's a nice way of celebrating culture. Sapos has a ritual that basically they used to have, I mean, they still have, but people working in a hybrid setting, they had a garden, and in that garden people can help grow produce during the pandemic, and then they eat the produce and then they celebrate and blah blah. So it's part of that community. They are very tribal in nature as a company. So when the pandemic started, they started sending people, the HR department sent like a herbs kit so people could grow their own herbs, like cilantro or tarragon or whatever, basil, and then people could share the experience. So it was a way of creating that connection. And that's important because rituals are emotional in nature. However, they're also a very important way of nudging behavior. So there's a company in Germany, Hazel for my German is not any, but you get the point, that has a ritual that's called Who's Gonna Ring the Bell? And basically, imagine that you're in a meeting, could be in-person, hybrid, completely remote meeting, and whenever the meeting that, hey, it happens more often than not, it's going south, it's derailing, it's not productive, anyone can ring the bell. This ritual is an invitation for people to pause and reflect on their own behavior, like, am I dragging this meeting down? What can I do better? How can I help the team reset, refocus? So people take a couple of minutes, they reflect, and then the meeting resumes, and often that meeting becomes more focused, more productive. So that's a very simple ritual that's focusing on improving behavior. And that's why we work a lot with clients, how you create rituals that promote the type of behavior that we want, not simply that they're kumbaya celebratory moments.
I love that example, Gustavo, of ringing the bell when the meeting is going off track as a great ritual. And want to underline the point that you made. A lot of teams and organizations have rituals. The question is whether the rituals are intentional rituals or not. So well thought out that we want to have this ritual because this is what we want to promote in our culture rather than this has just been part of our practice.
Exactly. And I think in a way, now we are on the final stage of the, I don't know if people follow rugby, the World Cup rugby. That's a hit. I was in Paris and everywhere was there, like people from all the world celebrating. And the All Blacks, the New Zealand's national team, which are one of the best teams, and they're going to be playing the final, they practice what they call the haka. The haka is inspired on their Aborigine Maori culture, which is a ritual that's very intimidating. It's a warrior type ritual that Maoris used to play before they go to war to intimidate their rivals, and the All Blacks do that. And people know a lot, and it's very famous. Even those who don't know anything about rugby, they probably have seen a video because it's very intimidating, very fierce. However, this fearful team practice a ritual behind the scenes that very few people know, which is after every match they clean their opponent's locker room and their own. Why do we do that? Because one of their core values is humility. They are one of the top most successful sports team in history. And one thing that they need to realize is they need to keep their feet on the ground to make sure they don't think they're the best and then they're going to lose. So in order to keep themselves grounded, they practice humility and taking care of that a mundane task of cleaning a locker room. That's the way they basically keep that value alive.
Oh, wow, Gustavo, what a beautiful example of something that truly helps them stay humble. And I can just imagine for a lot of Americans that don't follow rugby, think about one of the American football teams or baseball teams cleaning the locker room, both their locker room and the opposing team's locker room, as part of their values in order in that instance to keep that humility. Both what a beautiful example, but also something, it's a ritual that supports a value that the team and wants to have in that case and embrace.
Absolutely.
So, Gustavo, now mentioned briefly that there's different aspects of technology. We spent past 6-7 months in conversations at LGW, also with authors and thought leaders on artificial intelligence, which I truly believe that most people and most organizations have no clue how big of a shift it's going to be for us over the next few years in our lives. Want to get your thoughts with respect to technology, whether AI or just technological improvements and their impact on our interactions and our work in the near future, next few years.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing yet another revolution, and the world has gone through many. From the Industrial Revolution, people thought that people would never have a job, and here we are. So I think that AI and many other technologies are going to shift the workplace, but they're not going to eliminate humans. I think that at least for the next decade or 2 decades, we need to start thinking rather than seeing AI as an outsider invited to the basically table, to the team table. And I like to think of AI collaboration, right? The same way that we collaborate with other human beings, we are now collaborating with technology. And we collaborate with technology at a human level. So you're using, for example, ChatGPT to get some ideas, brainstorm, write an email, whatever that is. But also as a team member, we use artificial intelligence to create content, to debrief meetings or other ways that people are exploring. So I think that there are two elements when it comes to that. First, going back to culture, what's the company approach to AI or other technologies? And I'm not just talking about how we're going to use it, right, or the role it's going to play, but first, how does it connect with our values? And I think that that's a question that many CEOs are avoiding, not only the ethical side of AI, which is critical, but it is also the are we bringing AI to basically as a way to be more efficient and productive and get rid of people, or are we here to skilling up our people? So AI is going to take care of certain tasks and then we can elevate our talent. And very few people want to explicitly have that conversation with their team members or stakeholders. And the second, it's about, we talk about ethical things. For example, uh, one thing that happens with technology, and I remember like digital, all the different iterations of when social started like a decade or so ago, that first there's an acceleration, but then the system always get in the way, right? Like it happens with any innovation. So there are interests that come to play. For example, recently Medium, the New York Times, CNN are blocking AI from using their content to train bots, chatbots. Why? Because there's copyright issues, which me as an author are worried that people can access your content, repurpose, and then share your ideas for free or making money out of your content. But also the idea that why are some technology tools getting paid by using your skills? So I think that there's going to be an acceleration, but also big interest that are going to come to play, are going to get in the way. For example, going back to the origin of a conversation, talking about flexible work, we didn't talk about mayors, because if people work remotely, what happens with big downtowns business? Landlords that have huge buildings. So a lot of interest at play. So every time we're talking about the issues, we shouldn't forget about the bigger players that feed off that system, that when they see their interests hurt, they're also going to delay and disrupt, not necessarily for good reasons, the business.
There are interests and barriers. One great example of it on the AI front is that in many instances, AI can pick out tumors much better than radiologists can. But a lot of hospital systems and healthcare systems aren't using it, primarily because it does cause systems change. And there are a lot of barriers on the healthcare side. So I want to wrap up with your thoughts on a point you just touched on, Gustavo, that I know a lot of people, including in Greater Washington, D.C. Region, are having conversations around. I find it somewhat humorous that some of my friends in commercial real estate are big advocates of, you really need to be in the office 5 days a week for this to work. And I understand their interests. And I understand, however, on the other side, the implications this change will have on downtown spaces, on the economy of spaces, on public safety. There's so many of those issues. Would love to get your thoughts as a person who thinks about organizational culture, working in hybrid, and future of work, how this is going to impact these communal spaces that we share together, that in many instances we've come to get to know as offices.
Yeah. I would say that I'm not I don't have a crystal ball. So whenever we throw any kind of speculation about what the future is going to look like, either we're going to fall short, that the things that are going to happen faster and deeper than we think, and we're going to predict a lot of things that were never going to happen. However, it's important to understand concepts. So I think that when we talk about hybrid or flexible, actually we're talking about decentralization. So there are many majors that are exploring with, I don't know exactly, maybe I'm going to get this wrong, but the concept stays, which is they're talking with the 2.5-mile city. So they're thinking about cities in which basically people can walk to their workplace, they can work to get every services. So you know that, especially in the US, there's this idea of having like a major cities and then suburbs, and then you need to go to the mall and many big places that you have to drive to get everything. So this new approach that is happening in the US, it's happening in Canada, inspired by some European kind of cities, it's going to the centralization of smaller cities that are mostly walkable, right? And when it comes to real estate, it's not that the concept of having a physical space outside my house that it's going to die. What's going to happen is it's going to be decentralized. So less about those huge offices in downtown and many smaller spaces. There are companies that are experimenting with shared, and shared not in the sense of the typical rental that we know that we work or those, but shared in the sense of Mahan and Gustavo rent the same office space and we use it in different moments. So there are many companies that are so there are many models. I'm not saying that's the future. That's one of the many models that is going to start to show up. and companies start being more savvy about it. There are many companies that are reducing space. Some real estate is turning into hotels or other kinds of facilities, trying to repurpose that. I think that the companies that see that, I mean, offices are not going to disappear, but they're going to shrink. And the real estate agents that are thinking about what's next rather than defending themselves, they're going to thrive in the long run.
Yeah, it's, you mentioned it's hard to have clarity to where things are headed, but you share lots of outstanding insights on some of the flexibility and discipline that that future of work will have wherever we choose to work. Your book is outstanding, Gustavo. Remote, not distant. You have brilliant content on your site. So for LGW folks wanting to find out more about your book, obviously it's on Amazon and everywhere else where books are sold. But give them the details for your site and information, because you have, one of the things I love is that you have so much rich information where anyone who is interested in looking into culture, they can learn a ton from you and use a lot of frameworks and models in thinking through for their team and organization.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are over 1,000 articles and a lot of tools with facilitation guides and so on. So you can go to our site, which is fearlessculture.design, not .com. It's fearlessculture.design. And you can find there, I mean, there's a newsletter, so you can subscribe, but also you can browse tools and stuff that you need based on what you're looking for. And we have leadership content, tools, team building content, and of course, lots of culture design information.
Well, Gustavo, at some point, I'm hoping your travels will bring you to the nation's capital and the world capital here in Washington, D.C. So we can see you in person and I can give you a big hug in person. You've provided a lot of insights and value to me, and I appreciate you sharing it with the Leadership Greater Washington community as well. Thank you so much, Gustavo Razzetti.
Thank you, Mahan, and thank you, Leadership Greater Washington, for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to meet you in person next time. For sure.
Outstanding. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye.